Some of you will remember several decades ago, close to my home north of Lancaster, where Route 30 is, and 283 now goes out towards Harrisburg, and Route 30 comes out here towards York and Gettysburg, that there were acres and acres of rusty farm equipment. Clyde Keener, does anybody have any memory of it? Oh, okay, so some of you reached back to that. And then Clyde died in the mid-'80s, and there was an auction of all this stuff. And it ended up that my old order Mennonite neighbor, Jonas Reif, got an old rusty wagon chassis, like this one, but this actually isn't that one, but it's like it, except that at some point along the line in that auction, getting that wagon chassis out of the mud, which had now frozen, it broke the right front wheel spindle off. And so here was this. And Jonas brought this home to his place, and he had his setting in the woodlot there close to his home, just right behind where I live, for 15 years. And then I said to Jonas, I'm looking to buy a wagon chassis. Do you happen to have one? I suspected he did. He said, yes, but the spindle is broken off, but it's there, he said. So I took my little Farmall tractor and I drove over to Jonas's place and I hitched it up to this thing. The tires were all flat. The one wheel was missing, but I had the spindle. And this was this old, crippled, rusted wagon chassis that I dragged home. Just a little farm lane, just a quarter mile behind where I live. My wife, Karen, is usually a very supportive, lovable spouse. But she looked at that and she said, what on earth do you want with that thing? I said, we have this little 3-acre farm and I'd like to haul some wood to build a barn so I have a place to park my wagon. So I brought this thing home, and the wheels were the size that I couldn't find tires that fitted. So I went to Elias Byler over close to Groffdale and tramped all over his big pile of wheels and tires at his used farm equipment. I found wheels that I could find tires that would fit. And I put this thing together and I painted it, and I put a wooden bed on it. And the final crowning glory for this rusty old farm wagon is I was working at MCC, and one fall, one of my colleagues came to me and said, we'd like to put an MCC float in the Ephrata parade. Can we borrow your farm wagon? So Karen, you should know that rusty old 3-legged wagon was in the parade at Ephrata. How do we get from there to here? It's a very unlikely thing. I think if I would have told Karen when she was mildly and gently castigating me that I will put this in the Ephrata parade someday, she said she wouldn't have believed me. But what an unlikely source of something that eventually became this whole array of beautiful floats going down Main Street Ephrata in September, probably about 1999 or year 2000 maybe. That relates to our story here. What an unlikely source. Look at that rusty old wagon. And here he is coming to Jesus, asking Jesus for a favor. Word has gone out that this rabbi of Nazareth is able to do miracles. My servant is sick and may die. Please, can you come and help me? Do you know who was asking? This was a foreigner. Uncircumcised, heathen, Roman soldier. What an unlikely place for Jesus to, just let me go to people who at least have a basic understanding of who God is. You don't know anything. You have all of these Roman gods around you. Why are you asking me? What an unlikely place for faith to take root. But then that's not the biggest surprise. That's not the biggest surprise. The biggest surprise comes here. Imagine what this sounded like to his hearers. Here are all these good Jewish people who have been with him up on the mountain, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount, central to our understanding of Christian faith at Bethel Mennonite Church, the Sermon on the Mount. And then chapter 8 begins, and coming down from the mountain, and that's when the centurion. So this is the next thing. And here we have all these good, faithful Hebrew people looking on, and Jesus looks around after this servant says, well, just come because I know what authority is like and I know you have authority. Just say and it will be done. Jesus looks around and he says, I haven't found faith, such great faith. No, not in Israel. Heathen, Roman, soldier, rusty, old, wagon, chassis that has no future. But he pushes it out. Many shall come from the east and the west, sit together with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. This is profoundly shattering for the people who are listening to Jesus. Who is this character? We know who's in and we know who's out. And this heathen, uncircumcised, Gentile, Roman soldier is definitely out. But he's part of it. Many shall come from the east and the west and sit together with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And we can be part of that. We are a part of that. This year, as I'm sure you know, I was not at the ACC assembly, but I imagine this had some attention. 2025 is 500 years since the scriptural understandings which gave birth to the Bethel Mennonite Church came to the fore. What an unlikely place. What an unlikely place. 1,500 years after the centurion encounter, there is now again a new awakening of the spirit as people are learning to read the scriptures for themselves, because 80 years earlier, this guy in Mainz, Germany named Johannes Gutenberg had invented this new way of printing books. That books were now available. People could learn to read and people could read the scriptures for themselves. And this first book printed there in the Gutenberg press in Mainz, Germany was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible. And people are starting to read it. It takes 80 years for this foment to sort of bubble to the surface. And that's why we have this Reformation in the 1500s, because people say, the church I see expressed now and the church I see in the scriptures as I read it for myself are two very, very different things. And it led to the Reformation. And out of that major eruption and this flowing of the Reformation, there are some of these eddies in that stream of change that includes a group called the Anabaptists. And this all starts there where that red arrow is, right along that lake in the northern end, just outside of the city of Zurich, Switzerland, a little community called Zolliken, Switzerland, just south of Zurich. And here on the evening of January 21, 1525, you have George Blaurock being baptized by Conrad Grebel. And as historians look back to this, they say when that blue coat guy Blaurock Blue Coat was kneeling there to be baptized on confession of faith, even though he was baptized, as all babies in Europe were when a child, he is now rebaptized. He is the first Anabaptist. That is the birthday of the thinking and the theology and the movement which birthed eventually Bethel Mennonite Church. So we celebrate the 500 years this year. Sometimes we use the fancy word quincentennial, 500, quin, 5, centennial, 100. This is the spread of that movement since then. This is the Mennonite World Conference of Anabaptist churches around the world. And you can see how that unlikely source, faith, is budding in that prayer meeting in Zolliken in 1525. And now look how it has influenced the world. You can't read all the details, but you can see the macro picture. A lot of Anabaptists in North America, a lot of Anabaptists in East and Southern Africa and in India and Indonesia, and a smattering of other places around the world. Here's a picture from Myanmar, sometimes called Burma. And I did a little calculation on the Anabaptist groups in the world, and I calculated that one in every 375 individuals, or 3,755, I mean to say, individuals in the world is an Anabaptist. This includes a whole bunch of different groups, including the Mennonites, including Bethel Mennonite Church. So it's a very small group, but it's a very significant addition to the understanding of what it means to be Christian. And I would hasten to add and say we should not be so smug as to think we're the ones who are at the pinnacle of truth, but we share our Christian understanding with many other people all around the world. I would also hasten to add and say that the church 500 years ago, both the Anabaptist and the Roman Catholic, which was a dominant church in Europe 500 years ago, are not at the same places as they were then. And so we can find fellowship. In fact, when Karen and I lived internationally, when we lived in the primarily Islamic culture of Northern Africa and Khartoum, Sudan, fellow Christians that we knew were the Catholics. And so we're at a and we never feared for our life around the Catholics. So we're at a very, very different place than we were 500 years ago. And we should remember that we want to celebrate our understandings of the scriptures, but that does not subtract from the understandings that others may have. What do these churches around the world, these 2.1 million people around the world, share? This was a huge, huge task several years ago when there was an effort to try to boil it down to say, we all call ourselves Anabaptists. We all trace back to the 1500s, but what is it that we share in common? And so 7 shared convictions were developed that you can see there about God and Jesus and the church, a faith community, and the Holy Spirit, of peacemakers. We gather for worship, and we're a worldwide community of faith that transcends all the divisions that people try to drive from people to people. We live in a very divisive world currently, and the church is intended to span all of those divides. And so that you can see how well you might be doing it here if you just think about that. 2 congregations, one that's one of the newest congregations of which I'm aware. I'm sure it's not the newest one, but my friend Yasser Hamid Maki is an ordained Mennonite preacher he's a refugee out of Sudan, now living in Cairo, Egypt with his wife and children. And they meet in a little anteroom off the side of a hospital. And it's so tiny that recently Yasser emailed me and said, we have gone to 2 services. So if you look on the left of the picture, you see a lot of refugee people here coming together, speaking Arabic, worshiping in the Anabaptist tradition of this new congregation. And juxtaposed with that there is Langnau, Switzerland, which is the oldest Mennonite congregation, Anabaptist congregation in the world, dating from 1530. You can, 6 hours ago, they would have been having a worship service that you would have felt quite at home with in Switzerland there. So we have the old and the new. Ethiopia, the Mesorete Christos Church, is the largest Anabaptist tradition group in the world. If we could call this a conference or a denomination, Mesorete Christos Church. Who would have guessed back in 1945 when the Mennonite Board of Missions moved into Ethiopia that they would be planting a church that 80 years later, in fact, before 80 years later, but now 80 years later, had grown to hundreds of thousands of members and is the largest Anabaptist denomination in the world. You can see some of the movement there where Eastern Mennonite Missions went into Ethiopia. Karen's family, when she was a child, lived in Ethiopia, so she has memories of this. Chester Wanger from Lancaster area just died, lived well over 100 years old. He was one of the early missionaries. Chester had no idea when he went to Ethiopia with Sarah, his wife, and their young family, that out of that movement, this is so unlikely. These are folks that don't even have any clue what a Mennonite is. And now the Mesorete Christian Church, faith buds where you don't expect it to come out. That rusty farm wagon can bloom into something that is worthy of a parade. So MCC works with the Mesorete Christos Church on several fronts, but one of the more intriguing is this commitment to reading the gospel of Christ as a message of peacemaking. That church has translated that into going into prisons specifically to work at, which is something which is fairly common in their society, of these revenge killings. If you and my uncle had a fight and you killed my uncle, it is necessary for me or someone in my family to kill you or someone in your family. It's the only honorable thing to do. An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life. Revenge killing is a problem in Ethiopia. And the Anabaptist Church, the Mesorete Christos Church, said, we want to address that. And so this is a dicey thing because it's working in government prisons, and but it works. These people are able to go in and have these sessions of reconciliation. The gospel of Christ is a message of reconciliation. one of the things they do in the prison is a workshop. And so you can see it's fairly basic. There's not a lot of power tools, a lot of hand tools there. These are folks from the Masorete Christos Church in the workshop at the Mehameda prison. And there you see that's a really nice piece of furniture, a bed. This is all in the prison workshop. Here are two Mennonite chaplains who are in the discussion about this. So you have Mandarina, Ephra, and Karen in 2018. And this is a young woman who was caught up in these revenge killings. And at age 30, she went through this reconciliation project, and you can see the pensive look on her face, but she now has a future that she did not have before. The other major thing that Masorete Christos College Church does, because they are growing so rapidly, is that they are trying to train leaders. And so they have this college. It's a very nice college, but it's a very Spartan college. Some of you may have crossed paths with a man who worked in the field for many years, Carl Hansen. And the last time I was there, I saw they named the library at the Masorete Christos College, the Carl Hansen Library. So I thought that was interesting. But you can see there, it's fairly Spartan. These are students, it's crowded, they don't have a lot of resources. But the Masorete Christos Church is trying to create leaders which can serve this ever-expanding Anabaptist denomination in Ethiopia. Let's go to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, of course, this is part of the United States. And this all started with civilian public service. Some of you will remember well, you might not remember, but you'll remember the history. During World War II, after terrible experiences World War I here in the United States, Mennonite church leaders, joining with many other like-minded Christians, said, we must provide a way that young men who refuse military service but are still drafted can do some kind of alternative service. I'm curious whether anyone in this audience ever knew a CPS worker. Any CPSers? Some of you did. Yeah, they went into civilian public service. I am only personally aware of one person who is still living who was a CPSer, because we're at that age now where the draft ended in 1947, I believe, after the war was over. And if you'd have been 18 in 1947, you'd be quite elderly now. So there probably are more than one, there's probably more than one living, but I only personally know of one. But it was CPSers, part of the United States is Puerto Rico. At first, they were going to do work internationally. So there were some who went to China, but after a while, the government said, no, it must be within US or its territories. So they ended up in this case, in Ibanito, Puerto Rico, and they're working in healthcare. These are the Anabaptist groups that are in Puerto Rico today. They're all very small. There are 4 of them. They're sort of the larger group at the top, which is the one which grew out of the CPS work. And down at the bottom is a plain Mennonite group, the Southeastern Mennonite Conference. Some of you would know Christian Light Publishers next to the campus of Eastern Mennonite University. That is strongly influenced by Southeastern Mennonite Conference, and they're also one of the groups there. But you can see that this has taken root. This is one of the ways that Mennonites have connected with Puerto Rico. Edna Ruth Byler is on the far right of the picture. Her MCC administrator husband, Joe Byler, is sitting next to her. 1946, Edna Ruth Byler went to Puerto Rico with her husband, and she saw all these women doing these handicrafts and selling them in the market. And she said, what are you doing? They said, we're raising money for our families, school fees for our children, so forth. And Edna Ruth Byler said, well, do you mind if I buy some of your handicrafts and take them back and sell them? And today, Edna Ruth Byler is recognized as basically the birther, the matron of fair trade. And in MCC, now in an autonomous organization called 10,000 Villages, they trace it back to Edna Ruth Byler, just incidentally accompanying her MCC administrator husband to Puerto Rico. So that's a Puerto Rico connection. A modern Puerto Rico Mennonite Conference. This is a recent meeting where the larger Puerto Rico Mennonite Conference is together. Some of you will recall there was a fairly close association here with ACC for many years with the Puerto Rico. I think that's not of the same nature that it was years ago, but it's still a fairly close relationship. The legacy of CPSers going and working in healthcare is still present in Puerto Rico today. In fact, I get the impression sometimes that people in Puerto Rico who don't really know what Mennonite means think it's a medical term, because if you need good modern healthcare, and this just has really loose dotted lines connection to the church these days, but it is still the legacy of the Puerto Rico Mennonites. Healthcare, good healthcare is still a part of that. So this is the church living on in ways that it goes out further and further from where it began. Let's go to Indonesia. Indonesia is a country of many, many, many thousands of islands, and it's an expansive country. You see the light yellow colored areas there. To give you a picture from the east to the west, that would be as far as from New York to San Francisco. It's as a wide across Indonesia as it is in the United States. It's a huge, huge country. A very unlikely place for Anabaptist faith to grow. Here, look at this old rusty farm wagon 100 years ago. T. Sam Tat is a Chinese businessman. And he's following traditional Chinese religions. He doesn't even know anything about the Christian God, but his wife is secretly reading Bible stories. And when T falls ill, she says, why don't you go and see if you can find healing among the Christians? So he seeks out Christian fellowship. He doesn't find Christian fellowship with the Salvation Army or with a Seventh-day Adventist. And finally, he runs into Nikolai Tison in 1920, who was a Russian Mennonite missionary. You know that there were many Mennonites in Russia in the 1920s. In fact, that's when MCC began in 1920, going to Russian Mennonites who were suffering in Ukraine. And he is baptized. He is baptized as an adult, as an Anabaptist. And out of T's conversion, this unlikely place, this rusty farm wagon chassis becomes a thriving, thriving church. There are now 3 Anabaptist synods in Indonesia. The one that T has started is the GKMI, a very active, popular denomination in Indonesia. I like this picture because Indonesia has more Muslims than any other country. People would like to often think it's a place like Saudi Arabia or someplace. Well, it's because the population of Indonesia is so large, and many, many, many of the Indonesians are Muslims, that it is the most populous Muslim country in the world. And the Christians and the Muslims, while they differ are very, very critical places, at least they have learned to live together. And so this picture sort of shows that, where you have the Christian church with the cross on the right, and it's hard to see the crescent at the top of the minaret there, but the Muslim crescent on the, and they build a roof between their 2 places up. I would guess, I've never actually been to this location, but I would guess it's probably for celebrations. In a lot of societies, you close the street if you're going to have a wedding and you have a big party right in the street. That never happens to me when I speak in the Amish audience. Today, Indonesia has these three groups, and they host a Mennonite World Conference in 2022. And there's a strong Indonesian presence here. Some of you might know of the Philadelphia Praise Center. It's part of the Mosaic Conference, Mosaic coming together Franconia and Eastern District some years ago. They're still trying to find their way vis-a-vis the larger church, but the Indonesians are very much part of that. And in California, very active Indonesian Anabaptist congregations. Let me go to one that you didn't expect to hear this morning. The plain Anabaptists. These are the groups that maintain these distinctive characteristics that are visible, often in dress patterns. So sometimes I call them plain Anabaptists. We have folks who are the old order, the horse and buggy driving Mennonites and the old order Amish, all sharing the same rootage in 1525. And then we have some that drive cars and have modern technology. And then I would call it the assimilated church, the church that has chosen not to keep the plain exterior distinctions. And what does it mean for those that embrace the old way? History and tradition are significant, not to be quickly laid aside. Innovation must prove itself, that you don't just automatically adopt the latest innovation that comes out. There's constant change, but you don't think about how does the individual benefit from change, but you think about how does the community benefit from change, and it's not something that happens quickly. And this has created a lot of tension in a lot of the plain churches. So the level of technology, the internet has been a huge, huge issue for some of these churches. Just to sum it up, I took U.S. and Canada, and here are some of the plain Anabaptist groups. Some of you are familiar with the Hutterites. We don't have Hutterites in this area. We have a very close relative of the Hutterites called the Bruderhof in western Pennsylvania, south of Pittsburgh, and up into New York, the Hudson Valley. But the Hutterites have very, very large farming operations out in places like the Dakotas and into Canada. So the Hutterites, the Amish, the Old Order of Mennonites, and then I call them plain, not Old Order. In the last 50 years, a lot of plain groups have emerged. And then the Low German Mennonites. But if you look at the population, that's including unbaptized children and the membership, you'll see that there's a lot more in the United States than in Canada. Incidentally, this talk of measles outbreak in Texas is among the Low German speaking Mennonites of Russian background, plain people in Seminole, Texas. That's where the measles problem has been. But look at these numbers. When we look at the conservative and we look at those who are assimilated, the conservative groups in both the US and Canada are larger. Steve Nault teaches at Elizabethtown College and directs the Young Center at Elizabethtown College, a Young Anabaptist Pietistic Center. And I like a quote that Steve gave several years ago. He said, if someone asks you if most Mennonites drive buggies, he said the correct answer is no, not most Mennonites do not drive buggies, but more and more of them do all the time. And so that's interesting for us to observe. Those of us who were part of those who the stream about a century ago thought, you know, these backward plain people, these Amish, eventually they're going to have to catch up. They're just going to lag behind us. And eventually the modern church will be the future and the plain church will pass away. That has not happened. The plain church is growing faster than any other parts of the Anabaptist faith in the United States. It's not only getting bigger, but it's getting bigger faster all the time, like a snowball going down the hill. It's getting bigger faster. My own family is a microcosm of this. My parents had 8 children. My 2 older siblings were of the critical age in 1968 when the Eastern Pennsylvania Church started. Some of you would know what that, but I mean, it's a thing. Would be very much like the Mumelsburg Church. That's not Eastern Church, it's very similar. And my parents had 23 grandchildren, 43, I mean, 43 grandchildren. My 2 older siblings, who were part of the plain church, had 23 of them. The other 6 of us who stayed more with the Lancaster Conference kind of churches had 20 of them. And now it's being replicated the next generation. In my family, if you see the entire family coming together, you say, Ken's family is really, really plain. And yes, that's true. The 2 older siblings and their hordes of children and grandchildren. It's getting big fast. And you might say, well, yeah, but they're just really sort of localized. You know, they live just locally. There are 49 countries around the world, plain churches, all around the world. Amazing. It's an amazing thing to go to Kenya and visit with the Beachy Amish bishop, who is bishop over some of the Kenyan Beachy Amish people. Here I mentioned Mumelsburg Church. That would be locally. This is part of the Pilgrim Mennonite Conference, which is a conservative group. Many of you know that. We're what, 2-3 miles from where we're sitting right now. Some of you would know the Hers Ridge Mennonite Church. Some of you might have family there. This is another one of the plain groups. These are small congregations, but they're part of a much, much larger movement. And here we have Peckway Planter in Gap, Pennsylvania, where Gid Stoltzfus, who with his sons operate the Peckway Planter, working with Harry from Tanzania. This is an exchange program. Harry came from Tanzania to work with developing a plow planter for Tanzania. And he was staying with an Amish family and he said, "We want a straw hat." So Amos, his host dad, he said, "Well, I have a new straw hat, but it got wet and it shrank. It doesn't fit me anymore." So he gave it to Harry. So that Harry can almost look like an Amish, but in some respects, he doesn't quite look like an Amish. So what do we do with all this stuff? From the old farm wagon to 1525 to Ethiopia, Puerto Rico, Indonesia, and to the plain Mennonites. The Christian church is global. We know that, of course. The Anabaptist version of the Christian church is also global, and we're part of that. Bethel connects in numerous ways. We just had reference to the ACC meeting just last weekend. And then there's Mennonite Church USA, of which ACC is a part, and then Mennonite Church USA is part of the Mennonite World Conference. So we are organically connected to all these groups that we've been talking about. And it's important for us to realize that while we might be comfortable with our own understanding of faith and our own understanding specifically of Anabaptist faith, that doesn't necessarily place us in the center of what it means to be Anabaptist. We may not necessarily be the normative, the average, the like most Anabaptists. It's good for us to recognize. I encourage you to recognize Hers Ridge and Mumosburg as fellow Anabaptists because they're part of that larger family. And that is a fulfillment of what is becoming many shall come from the, I think my time's up. Many shall come from the east and the west and dwell together with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Let's pray together. Bless, O God, the global church, that they might proclaim the goodness to be found in Christ in many settings and many places around the world. Thank you for the fellowship, fellow Anabaptist Christians around the world today. We pray through Christ. Amen.